I never imagined that a single piece of parchment could change the course of a man's entire existence. Yet there I stood, in my late father's study on that cold October morning in 1684, holding the legal documents that had just transformed me from Edmund Hartwell, forgotten second son, into Edmund Hartwell, Viscount of Greystone Manor. The irony was not lost on me that at 26 years of age, I had spent my entire life preparing for a future that would never come, only to inherit one I had never wanted. The frost on the diamond-paned windows caught the early morning light, casting fractured rainbows across the oak-paneled walls where portraits of my ancestors gazed down with what seemed like disapproval. My hands, more accustomed to turning the pages of philosophy texts than handling deeds of inheritance, trembled slightly as I read the marriage contract for the third time. Lady Margaret Ashford, daughter of Lord Ashford of Ashford Hall, promised in matrimony to the heir of Greystone Manor. A bride I had inherited along with everything else. Charles should have been standing here instead of me. My elder brother, with his golden hair and easy charm, his natural way with horses and hounds, his certainty about his place in the world. But Charles lay cold in the family crypt, victim of a hunting accident that had stolen not just his life, but the very foundation of mine. The boar that had claimed him had, in one terrible moment, thrust upon me every responsibility I had spent my life avoiding. My father's voice echoed in my memory from his deathbed just a week prior. "Edmund, my boy," he had whispered, his once powerful hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "You must honor the agreement with Lord Ashford. The match was arranged in good faith, and a Hartwell's word is his bond. That girl has been waiting to become part of our family. You cannot abandon her now." His gray eyes, so like my own, had burned with an intensity that made argument impossible.
Promise-me, son.
"Promise me you will do your duty." I had promised, of course. What else could a grieving son do? But standing there in the study that still smelled of my father's pipe tobacco and leather-bound books, I wondered what kind of life I was condemning both myself and this unknown young woman to. I knew nothing of Lady Margaret beyond the basic facts outlined in the betrothal documents. She was 3 years my junior, well-educated according to the standards expected of her station, and apparently possessed of all the qualities deemed suitable for a viscountess. But what did any of that tell me about the woman herself? The logical part of my mind, trained by years of study in law and philosophy, understood the practical necessity of such arrangements. Marriage among families of our class was rarely about personal affection and always about alliance, property, and the continuation of bloodlines. Yet something in my nature, perhaps the very quality that had made me unsuitable as an heir in my father's eyes, rebelled against the idea of binding myself to a stranger out of mere obligation. I walked to the window and gazed out at the grounds of Greystone Manor, watching the gardeners rake the fallen leaves into neat piles that would soon feed the winter fires. The estate that was now mine stretched as far as the eye could see, its rolling hills dotted with tenant farms and bordered by ancient oak forests where I had spent countless hours as a child, reading beneath the spreading branches while Charles practiced swordplay with his tutors. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Hundreds of people depended on Greystone Manor for their livelihoods. Tenant farmers, servants, craftsmen, all looking to their lord for leadership and protection. I thought of Mrs. Henderson, our housekeeper, who had been with the family since before my birth, and of old Tom, the head groom who had taught both Charles and me to ride. They deserved a master who embraced his role with confidence and purpose, not one who felt like an impostor wearing clothes that belonged to another man. But it was not just the estate that troubled my thoughts as I stood there in the morning light. It was the knowledge that somewhere, perhaps at this very moment, Lady Margaret Ashford was preparing for a marriage to a man she had never met, bound by the same chains of duty and expectation that now constrained me. Was she resigned to her fate, or did she harbor hopes and dreams that this arrangement would crush? Did she mourn the loss of Charles, the man she had been promised to since childhood, or was she as indifferent to the change in bridegrooms as the lawyers seemed to expect? The clock on the mantel chimed 9 times, its deep bronze tones echoing through the silent room. I had delayed long enough. Honor demanded that I ride to Ashford Hall and present myself properly to my intended bride and her family. The marriage contract specified that the wedding would take place within 6 months of Charles's death, giving both families time to observe a proper period of mourning, while ensuring that the alliance would not be indefinitely postponed. Already, I could imagine the whispers that would follow if I delayed much longer. I folded the documents carefully and placed them in the leather satchel that would accompany me on my journey. Ashford Hall lay a day's ride to the north, through countryside I knew well from childhood visits with my father when he conducted business with Lord Ashford. The two men had been friends as well as neighbors, united by shared interests in breeding horses and improving their lands. It had been natural for them to seal their friendship with the promise of marriage between their children. The irony struck me again as I prepared to leave. Charles, who had known since boyhood that Lady Margaret would be his wife, had never shown particular interest in actually meeting her. "There will be time enough for that after the wedding," he had always said with a careless laugh. These arranged matches work out well enough. Look at our parents. It was true that our mother and father had been content together, if not passionate, but I found myself wondering if contentment would be enough for me. As I walked to the stables to prepare for my journey, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. Where Charles had been broad-shouldered and golden, I was lean and dark-haired, with the pale complexion of a man who spent more time with books than in the saddle. My gray eyes held a thoughtfulness that some had called melancholy, and my hands bore no calluses from sword work or field sports. Would Lady Margaret be disappointed by the substitution? Would she see in me only a poor shadow of the man she had been promised? The November air was crisp and clean as I emerged from the manor house, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from the village chimneys and the earthy smell of autumn's decay. My horse, a steady bay gelding named Scholar, waited patiently as the groom adjusted his tack. Scholar had been a gift from my father on my 21st birthday, chosen more for his calm temperament than his speed, a mount suitable for a scholarly second son rather than a future lord. Now, it seemed we would both have to grow into roles we had never expected to fill. As I mounted and urged Scholar toward the road that would take me to Ashford Hall, I found myself wondering what the next few hours would bring. Would I find in Lady Margaret a kindred spirit who, like me, felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control? Or would I discover that she was everything a proper young lady should be, content with her prescribed role and expecting the same contentment from me? The road stretched ahead through the golden autumn landscape, and with each step my horse took, I moved closer to a future that felt as uncertain as the morning mist rising from the fields. The journey to Ashford Hall took me through countryside that grew wilder and more desolate as the day progressed. Ancient stone walls lined the road, broken in places where time and weather had claimed their victory, and the trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the weak autumn sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. By late afternoon, when the towers of Ashford Hall finally came into view, I could see why Lord Ashford had been so eager to secure an advantageous marriage for his daughter. The estate, while still grand in its Gothic architecture, showed clear signs of financial strain. Several windows in the east wing were boarded up, ivy had been allowed to grow unchecked across much of the stone facade, and the once magnificent gardens had taken on a wild, untended appearance. As I rode up the circular drive, I noticed that the cobblestones were loose in places, and weeds grew between the stones where proper maintenance would have kept them clear. A stable boy appeared to take Scholar's reins. Though his clothes were patched and his manner suggested he served multiple roles beyond caring for horses. He looked at me with curiosity, no doubt wondering if I was the expected guest his master had been awaiting with such obvious anxiety. Lord Ashford himself appeared at the main entrance before I had even reached the steps, his eagerness evident in the way he hurried forward to greet me. He was a man in his late 50s, still handsome despite the lines that worry had etched around his eyes, and his clothes, while well-tailored, showed the subtle signs of a wardrobe that had not been updated in several years. "Lord Hartwell," he said, extending his hand with a warmth that felt both genuine and desperate. "Welcome to Ashford Hall. I am deeply sorry for your loss, my boy. Your brother was a fine young man, and your father was one of my dearest friends." His grip was firm, but I could feel a slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of nerves barely held in check. "Thank you, Lord Ashford," I replied, allowing him to guide me toward the entrance. "My father spoke often of your friendship. I hope to prove worthy of the trust both our families have placed in this arrangement." As we entered the great hall, I was struck by the contrast between the building's impressive architecture and its current state. The ceiling soared above us, supported by carved wooden beams that spoke of centuries of Ashford pride, but several of the tapestries that adorned the walls showed signs of moth damage, and the rushes on the floor were not as fresh as they should have been. Still, there was an undeniable nobility to the place, a sense of history and tradition that spoke to something deep in my soul. Lady Ashford awaited us in the main drawing room, and I could see immediately where the family's priorities lay. Unlike her husband, she had clearly spared no expense in maintaining her appearance. Her gown was of the finest silk, her jewelry tasteful but expensive, and her bearing was that of a woman accustomed to command. Yet there was something cold in her manner, a calculating quality that made me instinctively cautious. "Lord Hartwell," she said, offering her hand to be kissed in the formal manner. "How good of you to come so promptly. We have been most eager to make your acquaintance and to discuss the arrangements for the wedding." Her smile was perfectly practiced, but it did not reach her eyes, and I noticed that she made no mention of her daughter. The evening meal that followed was an elaborate affair, clearly designed to impress despite the family's strained circumstances. The dining room was lit by dozens of candles, their flames reflecting off silver that, while tarnished in places, was still magnificent. The food was excellent, prepared by what was obviously a skilled cook, though I noticed that the portions were somewhat modest and the wine, while good, was not of the quality that such a household would once have served without thought. Throughout the meal, I waited for Lady Margaret to join us, but the chair that had obviously been set for her remained conspicuously empty. When I finally ventured to ask about my intended bride, Lady Ashford's expression became even more rigid. "Margaret is not feeling quite herself this evening," she said in a tone that brooked no further inquiry. "The excitement of your arrival has rather overwhelmed her delicate constitution. She sends her apologies and hopes to meet you tomorrow when she has had proper rest." Lord Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I caught a fleeting expression cross his face that suggested there was more to his daughter's absence than a case of nerves. However, good manners prevented me from pressing the matter further, though my curiosity was thoroughly aroused. The conversation that followed was stilted, filled with the kind of careful small talk that people make when they are all thinking about the same thing but cannot speak of it directly. Lord Ashford told me about improvements he hoped to make to the estate, speaking with the enthusiasm of a man trying to convince himself as much as his listener. Lady Ashford discussed the wedding arrangements with the single-minded focus of a general planning a military campaign, though I noticed she avoided any mention of the bride's preferences or opinions. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly aware that something was not quite right about the situation. The servants moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to be unobtrusive, and more than once I caught them exchanging meaningful glances when they thought no one was looking. There was an air of secrecy about the household that troubled me, though I could not put my finger on exactly what was wrong. When I finally retired to the guest chamber that had been prepared for me, I found myself standing at the window, looking out over the darkened grounds and wondering about the woman I was supposed to marry. What kind of person was Lady Margaret that her own parents spoke of her with such careful neutrality? Was she truly ill, or was there some other reason for her absence from what should have been an important family occasion? The room they had given me was comfortable enough, though like everything else in the house, it showed signs of genteel decline. The bed hangings were of good quality but faded, the carpet worn in places, and the fire in the grate was smaller than hospitality would normally dictate. Yet there was something about the chamber that suggested it had once been magnificent, and I found myself wondering if Lady Margaret's quarters showed similar signs of a family struggling to maintain appearances. Sleep was slow to come that night. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of an old house settling around me, and tried to imagine what the next day would bring. Would Lady Margaret prove to be the kind of biddable young woman her mother clearly expected, content to marry a stranger for the sake of family duty? Or might I find in her some spark of the independence and intelligence that I valued so highly in my own character? The wind picked up as the night deepened, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves skittering across the courtyard below. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my room, but when I listened more carefully, there was only silence. The mystery of my absent bride grew deeper with each passing hour, and I found myself both dreading and anticipating the moment when we would finally meet. When morning finally came, gray and misty with the promise of rain, I dressed carefully and made my way down to the breakfast parlor, hoping that Lady Margaret would join her family for the morning meal. But once again, her chair remained empty, and her parents' explanations grew increasingly strained. It was then that I resolved to take matters into my own hands and discover for myself what secret Ashford Hall was so determined to keep hidden. My opportunity came sooner than expected. After breaking my fast alone while Lord Ashford attended to estate matters and Lady Ashford claimed a headache that conveniently required her to remain in her chambers, I found myself with the freedom to explore the manor. I told myself I was simply taking the air and familiarizing myself with what would soon be my second home. But in truth, I was driven by a curiosity that had grown stronger with each evasive answer about my intended bride. The servants I encountered seemed nervous in my presence, offering quick curtsies or bows before hurrying away as if they feared lingering too long might get them into trouble. Their behavior only deepened my suspicion that there was something about Lady Margaret that the family preferred to keep hidden. I began to wonder if she suffered from some illness that would make her an unsuitable wife, or perhaps some defect of character that her parents were desperate to conceal until after the wedding ceremony made retreat impossible. It was while wandering through the older sections of the house that I first heard it, a sound so faint I might have missed it entirely if not for the perfect silence that seemed to pervade Ashford Hall. From somewhere below, carried through the stone walls and wooden floors, came the gentle rhythm of someone working. The sound was repetitive, almost meditative, like the whisper of fabric against fabric or the soft tap of a needle against a thimble. Following the sound led me down a narrow stone staircase I had not noticed before, tucked away behind a tapestry that depicted scenes of medieval hunting. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and as I descended, the air grew cooler and carried with it the scent of old stone and something else, something warmer and more human that spoke of recent habitation. The staircase ended in a corridor that ran beneath the main floor of the house, lit by small windows set high in the walls that allowed only thin streams of daylight to penetrate the gloom. Doors lined both sides of the passage, most of them standing open to reveal storage rooms filled with the accumulated possessions of generations. But at the far end, A single door remained closed, and from behind it came the soft sounds that had drawn me down from the world above. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that what I was about to do crossed the bounds of proper behavior. A gentleman did not go searching through his host's private chambers, particularly when those chambers might belong to his intended bride. Yet something about the secrecy surrounding Lady Margaret compelled me forward. If I was to bind my life to hers, surely I had the right to know what manner of woman I was marrying. The door opened silently at my touch, revealing a room that took my breath away. What had clearly once been a cellar storage chamber had been transformed into something that resembled a lady's sitting room, though one designed more for function than display. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with the usual feminine ornaments but with baskets of thread in every color imaginable, bolts of fabric ranging from the finest silk to the most practical wool, and tools whose purpose I could only guess at but which spoke of serious work rather than idle pastime. But it was the occupant of the room who truly captured my attention. Seated at a small table beneath one of the high windows, her back to the door, was a young woman bent over an embroidery frame. The candlelight, for even in daylight the room required illumination, caught the auburn highlights in her dark brown hair, which was arranged in a simple style that spoke more of practicality than fashion. She wore a gown of deep blue wool that, while well made, was clearly chosen for warmth and durability rather than to impress. For a moment, I simply watched her work. Her hands moved with the assured precision of long practice, creating patterns of such intricate beauty that I found myself leaning forward to see them more clearly. The piece she was working on appeared to be a wall hanging depicting a garden scene, but the level of detail was extraordinary. Every flower seemed to have individual petals, every leaf its own character, every element contributing to a whole that was breathtaking in its complexity and artistry. It was then that she became aware of my presence. Her hands stilled, and slowly, very slowly, she turned to face me. What I saw in that moment changed everything I thought I knew about beauty, about perfection, and about the arbitrary standards by which society judged the worth of its members. Lady Margaret Ashford was, without question, one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. Her eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, large and expressive, framed by long dark lashes. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a mouth that suggested both gentleness and determination. Her complexion was pale but healthy, with the kind of translucent quality that spoke of good breeding and careful protection from the sun. But running from her left temple down to her jaw was a scar, raised and still slightly pink despite what must have been years of healing. It was the kind of mark that told a story of violence or accident, transforming what would have been conventional beauty into something far more compelling. Rather than detracting from her appearance, the scar somehow enhanced it, giving her face a character and depth that mere perfection could never achieve. For a long moment we simply stared at each other. I saw in her eyes a complex mixture of emotions: surprise at my unexpected appearance, shame at being discovered in what was clearly her refuge from the world above, and something else that might have been relief at finally coming face to face with the man she was supposed to marry. "Lord Hartwell," she said finally, her voice low and musical despite the obvious tension in her tone. "I suppose my parents' careful plans have come to nothing. You have found me out in my hiding place." There was no self-pity in her words, only a kind of weary resignation that struck me as infinitely sad. She made no attempt to turn her scarred side away from me, nor did she offer any explanation for her presence in this underground chamber. Instead, she simply waited, as if preparing herself for whatever judgment I might pronounce upon her. "Lady Margaret," I replied, struggling to find words that would not sound either patronizing or false. "I have been hoping to make your acquaintance since my arrival. Your parents mentioned that you were not feeling well." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Not feeling well," she repeated. "Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe it. Tell me, my lord, now that you have seen me, do you understand why I prefer the solitude of the cellars to the drawing rooms above?" Her directness caught me off guard. I had expected tears or pleading, or perhaps the kind of feminine vapors that my mother's generation seemed to consider appropriate responses to awkward situations. Instead, Lady Margaret faced me with a calm dignity that demanded an equally honest response. "I understand why your parents might think the scar would matter to a potential husband," I said carefully, "but I confess I do not understand why it would matter to you." She looked at me with something that might have been surprise. "You speak as if you have never lived in polite society, Lord Hartwell. Surely you know that a woman's primary value lies in her ability to ornament her husband's position. A scarred face is hardly an ornament that any man would choose to display." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that this was a woman who had been taught to think of herself as damaged goods, hidden away like a shameful secret until she could be disposed of in marriage to a man who might be desperate enough to overlook her supposed flaw. "Perhaps," I said, moving closer to her table so I could see her work more clearly, "you have been listening to the wrong people. This embroidery, for instance," shows a skill and artistry that would be admired in any drawing room in London. And as for your face, I find myself wondering not about the scar, but about the courage it must have taken to survive whatever caused it. She stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. You are either the kindest man in England, she said slowly, or the most skilled liar. I cannot decide which would be worse for a marriage partner. Her honesty was both refreshing and challenging. Here was a woman who had clearly learned not to expect kindness or consideration, yet who retained enough spirit to speak her mind even to the man who held her future in his hands. I found myself more intrigued by her in these few minutes than I had been by any woman in my entire life. Perhaps, I suggested, settling myself on a stool near her table, you could tell me about your work while I try to convince you that I am neither particularly kind nor particularly skilled at deception. I am, however, genuinely curious about what has brought you to this remarkable sanctuary. That first conversation in the cellar stretched on for hours, and with each passing minute, I found myself drawn deeper into the remarkable world that Lady Margaret had created for herself. She told me about the accident that had scarred her face, a riding mishap when she was 17 that had thrown her against a stone wall. Her recovery had been long and painful, but it was during those months of convalescence that she had discovered her extraordinary talent for needlework. At first, she explained, her fingers never ceasing their delicate work as she spoke, it was simply something to occupy my hands while I healed, but then I began to see that I could create things of beauty, things that would outlast my own life. The work became a refuge, and eventually, it became my livelihood. Her livelihood. The words struck me like a physical blow as I began to understand the true extent of her situation. This was not the idle pastime of a wealthy young lady, but the desperate enterprise of someone who had been forced to find her own way in a world that offered few options for women of her class. The pieces she created were not just beautiful objects, but the difference between dignity and destitution. You sell your work? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the purposeful way she had organized her materials and the evidence of multiple projects in various stages of completion. Through a seamstress in the village, she confirmed, not lifting her eyes from her embroidery. She passes it off as her own work to customers who travel through from London and other cities. They pay well for what they believe to be local folk art, never suspecting that it comes from the supposedly delicate fingers of a nobleman's daughter. The arrangement was both practical and heartbreaking. Margaret had found a way to support herself and probably contribute to her family's struggling finances, but she had to do it in secret, hiding her talent as if it were another shameful deformity rather than the remarkable gift it truly was. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to that cellar room again and again. Officially, I was staying at Ashford Hall to become better acquainted with my intended bride and to make the necessary arrangements for our wedding. But in reality, I was drawn by the fascinating woman I had discovered in that underground sanctuary. Margaret was unlike anyone I had ever known. Her intelligence was sharp and quick, her observations about the world around her both insightful and surprisingly well-informed for someone who had supposedly been hidden away from society. She had educated herself through reading, borrowing books from her father's library, and even purchasing others with the money she earned from her needlework. Our conversations ranged from philosophy to politics, from literature to the practical challenges of estate management. She knew more about the actual workings of agriculture and commerce than most men of my acquaintance, having learned by necessity to understand the sources of income that her family so desperately needed. I began bringing her materials for her work, claiming to her parents that I was simply taking rides around the countryside to familiarize myself with the area. In reality, I was traveling to nearby towns to purchase the finest threads and fabrics I could find, delighting in the way her eyes would light up when I presented her with a particularly beautiful silk or a set of needles crafted by a master artisan. But our growing friendship could not remain secret forever, particularly not with Lady Ashford's sharp eyes watching every move I made. I began to notice her hovering near doors when I thought I was unobserved, and more than once I caught her questioning servants about my whereabouts. The pressure she was putting on both her husband and her daughter to finalize the wedding arrangements grew more intense with each passing day. It was during my third week at Ashford Hall that the situation came to a head in the most dramatic way possible. I had just returned from one of my supposed rides, actually a trip to purchase a particularly fine selection of golden threads that would perfect a piece Margaret was working on, when I found the main hall in an uproar. Lady Ashford stood in the center of the entrance, her face flushed with anger, while her husband paced back and forth with the agitated movements of a man pushed beyond his endurance. "Where is she?" Lady Ashford demanded as soon as she saw me. "Where is that ungrateful girl? She was supposed to be in the drawing room an hour ago to meet with the vicar about the wedding ceremony, and instead her maid found her room empty with the bed unslept in." Before I could formulate a response that would not give away Margaret's secret refuge, a new voice cut through the tension. "I am here, mother," Margaret said, appearing at the top of the main staircase with a dignity that made her mother's hysteria seem even more unseemly by comparison. I apologize for my tardiness. I was occupied with a project that required my immediate attention. But Lady Ashford was beyond reason. Project? She spat. What project could possibly be more important than preparing for your wedding? Do you have any idea how precarious our situation has become? How much depends on this marriage proceeding smoothly? It was then that a new element entered our domestic drama. The sound of hooves on gravel announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor, and moments later, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood was announced by a servant who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Sir Geoffrey was a man I knew by reputation, though we had never been formally introduced. In his middle 50s, with the kind of florid complexion that spoke of too much wine and too little exercise, he was known throughout the county for his wealth, his cruelty to his tenants, and his habit of acquiring property from families in financial distress. Lord and Lady Ashford, he said, sweeping into the hall with the confident manner of a man accustomed to getting his own way. I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I have come on a matter of some urgency. His eyes swept the room until they found Margaret, still standing on the staircase, and I saw something predatory in his gaze that made my blood run cold. Sir Geoffrey, Lord Ashford replied, his voice carefully neutral. You are always welcome at Ashford Hall. May I present Lord Hartwell? He is here on family business. Sir Geoffrey's acknowledgement of my presence was perfunctory at best. His attention remained fixed on Margaret in a way that made me want to step between them. Lord Hartwell, yes, I had heard about the change in circumstances. Tragic about your brother, but perhaps fortunate in other ways. There was something in his tone that I did not like, a suggestion that he knew more about our situation than a casual neighbor should. Lady Ashford, meanwhile, had gone very pale, and I noticed that her husband's hands had begun to tremble slightly. I have come, Sir Geoffrey continued, to make a proposition that I believe will be of interest to all parties concerned. I am in need of a wife, preferably one with the breeding necessary to manage my household and provide heirs for my estate. I am prepared to overlook certain physical imperfections in exchange for a very generous settlement that would solve all of the Ashford family's financial difficulties immediately. The room fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the wind whistling through the eaves of the old building. Margaret stood frozen on the staircase, her face as white as her mother's, but her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that I was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her nature. Sir Geoffrey, I said, stepping forward before anyone else could respond. I believe you may be under a misapprehension about the situation here. Lady Margaret is already promised in marriage to me. His laugh was unpleasant, filled with the kind of casual cruelty that I suspected characterized most of his dealings with people he considered beneath his notice. Oh, my dear boy, he said. Promises made to dead men are easily broken when circumstances change. I have reason to believe that the Ashford family's debts have reached a point where they cannot afford to wait for wedding settlements and dowries to be negotiated through the usual lengthy process. What I offer is immediate relief, cash in hand, and a wedding that could take place within the month. It was then that I realized the true depths of the Ashford family's desperation, and the reason for Lady Ashford's increasingly frantic attempts to hurry our wedding along. They were not just struggling financially. They were on the verge of complete ruin, and Sir Geoffrey knew it. He was here to offer them a devil's bargain, immediate salvation in exchange for their daughter's happiness and future. The tension in that moment was so thick I could almost taste it. Margaret descended the staircase with measured steps, her composure remarkable given the circumstances, and positioned herself beside her parents with the dignity of a queen facing her executioners. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the impossible situation she faced. Sir Geoffrey, she said, inclining her head with just enough courtesy to avoid outright rudeness. Your offer is unexpected, but I must inform you that my affections and my promise are already engaged elsewhere. Her eyes met mine across the room, and in them I saw not just defiance, but something deeper, something that gave me the courage to do what I knew I must. Furthermore, I said, stepping forward to stand beside her, I should mention that Lady Margaret and I have already begun to know each other quite well, and I find myself not merely satisfied with our arrangement, but genuinely delighted by it. Any suggestion that our engagement might be dissolved is both premature and unwelcome. Sir Geoffrey's face darkened with anger. Delighted, he sneered, by a scarred spinster who hides in cellars like a common servant? My dear Hartwell, your standards are remarkably low for a man of your station. Perhaps you should consider what kind of children such a union might produce. It was then that something inside me snapped. All the weeks of watching Margaret hide her light under a bushel, all the evidence of her family's fear that her scar made her unmarriageable, all the casual cruelty of a society that judged human worth by physical perfection came together in a moment of perfect clarity. Sir Geoffrey, I said, my voice carrying the authority that my new title gave me, you will speak of Lady Margaret with respect, or you will not speak of her at all. As for her supposed imperfections, I can only say that a man who cannot see past a scar to the extraordinary woman beneath it is a man whose opinion holds no value whatsoever. I turned to face Margaret directly, knowing that what I was about to do would change everything between us. Margaret, I said, using her given name for the first time in public. I have something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago when I first discovered you in your workshop. I did not come here expecting to fall in love. But that is exactly what has happened. The woman I found creating beauty in that cellar, the woman who turned necessity into art and isolation into independence, that woman has captured my heart completely. The look of wonder that crossed her face was worth every risk I was taking. You love me? She whispered, as if the words were too precious to be spoken aloud. I love your intelligence, your talent, your courage, and yes, I love your face, scar and all, because it tells the story of your strength. If Sir Geoffrey cannot see that, then he is not worthy to kiss the hem of your dress, let alone offer for your hand. Sir Geoffrey's face had gone purple with rage. You fool, he shouted. Do you think love will pay their debts? Do you think romance will keep this family from losing everything they own? I offer them salvation, and you offer them pretty words. Actually, I said, reaching into my jacket for the documents I had prepared during my long weeks at Ashford Hall. I offer them something rather more substantial than words. I handed the papers to Lord Ashford, who took them with trembling hands. You will find there a complete accounting of the Ashford estate's debts, along with a plan for their resolution that involves no charity, but rather a business partnership that will allow your family to maintain their dignity while restoring their prosperity. Lord Ashford's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. Edmund, this is extraordinary. But how did you know the extent of our difficulties? Your daughter told me, I replied. During our many conversations over the past weeks, I came to understand that she knows more about the practical aspects of estate management than most stewards. She helped me devise a plan that would use her remarkable talents as the foundation for a legitimate business enterprise, one that could employ local women and bring prosperity to the entire district. Margaret stared at me in amazement. You want to make my needlework into a real business? I want to make you into what you already are. An artist and an entrepreneur whose work deserves to be celebrated, not hidden. London society pays enormous sums for inferior embroidery created by inferior talents. Imagine what they would pay for work of true genius, properly presented and marketed. The transformation in the room was remarkable. Lady Ashford, who had been pale with desperation only moments before, now looked at her daughter with something approaching respect for the first time in years. Lord Ashford was studying the business plan with the enthusiasm of a man seeing hope where there had been only darkness. Sir Geoffrey, however, was not finished. You think this changes anything? He snarled. You think a few pretty plans on paper will solve years of accumulated debt? I could buy this estate tomorrow and evict the lot of you. No, I said quietly, you could not, because as of this morning, I have purchased the outstanding mortgages on Ashford Hall from the various creditors who held them. They were quite willing to sell them to me at a discount, particularly when I explained that I had every intention of working with the current owners to ensure their full repayment rather than forcing a sale. The silence that followed was profound. Sir Geoffrey looked as if he had been struck by lightning, while the Ashford family stared at me with expressions of disbelief and dawning hope. You did this for us? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I did this for love, I replied. Love of you, love of justice, and love of the idea that talent and worth should be rewarded rather than hidden away in cellars. If you're enjoying this story of how love can transform the most unexpected circumstances, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to storytellers like me. What happened next felt like something from a fairy tale, though it was accomplished through the very practical means of legal documents and business contracts. Sir Geoffrey departed in a fury, his schemes thwarted and his reputation damaged by his public display of cruelty. The Ashford family, freed from the crushing weight of their debts, began to flourish as they had not done in years. But the greatest transformation was in Margaret herself. No longer forced to hide her talents or her face, she emerged from her underground workshop like a butterfly from its cocoon. The business we established together, with her as the chief designer and director, became the talk of London society within 6 months. Noble ladies competed to purchase her creations, never suspecting that the artist they so admired was the same damaged goods that their own prejudices would have dismissed without a second thought. Our wedding, when it finally took place the following spring, was a celebration unlike any the county had ever seen. Instead of the hurried, shameful affair that Sir Geoffrey had suggested, it became a joyous festival that lasted 3 days and brought together people from every level of society. Margaret wore a gown of her own design, embroidered with such intricate beauty that several guests wept openly at the sight of it. But the moment I treasure most came during the ceremony itself, when the vicar asked if anyone knew of any impediment to our union. Margaret looked directly at me and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, only that I love him far too much for any one woman's heart to contain. 5 years have passed since that day, and I can honestly say that every morning I wake up grateful for the hunting accident that changed the course of my life. Margaret and I now have 2 children, a boy and a girl, both of whom show signs of inheriting their mother's artistic gifts. More importantly, they are growing up in a world where they understand that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the courage to be authentically oneself. The business Margaret founded has grown beyond our wildest dreams, employing dozens of women throughout the county and bringing prosperity to families who had known only hardship. But Margaret herself remains my greatest treasure, the woman who taught me that love is not about accepting someone despite their flaws, but about recognizing that what the world sees as flaws might actually be the very qualities that make someone perfect for you. As I write these words in the study that was once my father's, I can hear the sound of laughter from the garden where Margaret is teaching our daughter the basics of embroidery, while our son attempts to capture butterflies in a net. The sound fills me with a contentment I never thought possible during those dark days when I believed my life had been derailed by circumstances beyond my control. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest disasters. Sometimes the inheritance we think we don't want turns out to be exactly what we need. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to look beyond the surface, we discover that the person hiding in the shadows is actually the light we've been searching for all our lives. So remember, dear friends, that love has a way of finding us when we least expect it, and often in the places we're least inclined to look. The next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit society's narrow definition of perfection, ask yourself whether you might be missing out on something extraordinary. And if this story has touched your heart in any way, please consider subscribing to hear more tales of love, hope, and the beautiful unpredictability of human nature. After all, every scar tells a story, and every story has the potential to change a life.